It began with the sound of hollow metal vibrating against wooden joists, a murmuring and annoying knocking, but building up into a crescendo, getting faster and faster. And as you wake from slumber interrupted, eyes glued shut, you hear it before you feel it. The metal against wood like a staccato drumbeat as wood and glass creak and crack in large streaks across the window looking out over downtown Los Angeles. It feels like our hillside home is cracking in two. A cupboard door in the kitchen over the sink swings open, and 20 of my favorite glasses begin to fall out like lemmings and ending up on the counter, splintering on the tile floor, shards of broken crystal. It began in the twilight space between sleep and being awakened. You heard it first, like the plucking of the string of a broken double bass before its neck is cracked. You felt its powerful shudder. The earth groaned for all of 20 seconds, yet you felt it forever. Do I have enough time to run to safety? So much longer, enough time to jump out of bed, to throw on some shoes and a robe. Danger, survival. My reptile brain kicked in. Should I stand in this metal framework of a door outside my house if the house collapses down the hillside? Can I jump? Can I escape? So I open the door in time to see the car that's sitting on a carport, and the car is swaying from side to side. These were all seconds when all sorts of images and sounds came flooding over me on that unforgettable day in January 1994. Was this the big one that had been predicted that would come one day? And it wasn't my first earthquake in Los Angeles, but hitting the scale at 6.7, this was the biggest I'd ever felt. And what is different about an earthquake as opposed to other natural disasters, by the time you've figured it out, it's over. In a moment when your brain and your body simply do not comprehend what is fully happening, and you need to look outside yourself, a kind of reference point. What is happening? How big is this? And for us, the reference point was if the buildings in downtown LA that we could see from our window were still standing, it wasn't the big one. The buildings were still standing. And we were alive. It wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't the end of the California dream. But I will never forget the impact on memory and cell and fiber in my body that morning, 4:30 a.m. 60 people perish in that moment. 9,000 are injured. Millions of dollars in destruction in the Northridge earthquake. It happened, it's the equivalent of Poughkeepsie to here. The epicenter would have been in Poughkeepsie. You heard it before you felt or saw it. Mother Earth reminding us that we are like fleas on her back as she stretches and scratches. And we are knocked out of our sense of stability and security, at least for a few minutes. Life goes on. And it's interesting that this first Sunday of Advent, it's that image of earthquake that Isaiah goes to. And Isaiah is kind of frustrated with his community. And he's saying basically, God, wake us up. Send us the big one. Shake us up. Help us to figure out what's going on. And show the sheer force of nature and Creator. Why don't you just shake us all up? Come and show us who's boss. Oh, that thou wouldst open the heavens and come down, mountains quaking, brushwood on fire, water boiling, so that the nations might tremble at your presence. So this theme of waking up, like the earthquake waking me up between slumber and flight, My life flashes before me. Is this it? There was a very sad story in that occasion where a young motorcyclist, policeman, is going, I think, in response to a call, and a whole section of the freeway had collapsed and he didn't have time to see it, and he drove to his death. People just taken in a moment. Sleepers wake, the gospel shouts this season. The hymns are rousing, invite us to look up and be attentive. Jan Richardson describes Advent like this. The season of Advent means that there's something on the horizon, the likes of which we have never seen before. It is not possible to keep it from coming because it will. That's just how Advent works. What is possible is not to see it, to miss it, to turn just as it brushes past you. And you begin to grasp what it was you missed, like Moses in the cleft of the rock, watching God's hinterquarters fade into the distance. So stay, linger, tarry, ponder, wait, behold, wonder. There will be time enough for running, for rushing, for worrying, for pushing. For now, stay, wait. Something is on the horizon, she says. But our human nature, being what it is, has a hard time with this invitation. It is not only countercultural, but this biblical wake-up call is often peddled by religious people to get other people to do things that they really don't want to do. It's a kind of psychological manipulation or abuse to frighten us rather than to help people deal with life's fragility and impermanence. Fear of non-existence is peddled for eternal life and salvation. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the church has frequently distorted what Advent essentially offers us freely. The waiting, the seeing, and the awareness must come from inside each one of us. And to see the Advent moments that are already in our lives. That's the invitation today. How we live Advent. And preachers can use themes and texts like today's to manipulate and frighten into some forced response, when the real invitation is to take the time to reflect on the Advent moments already in our lives. The moments that we wake up to, like the earthquake image was certainly an Advent moment for me. And to see in darkness and despair or a vacuum of time of unfulfilled longing, not as a time of judgment or punishment, we've done something wrong that we're not getting to where we want to get to, but to see it as a different time to be with God. Last week I spoke about how we approach the judgment text during Advent and look beyond the doom and the gloom and the endings that they often conjure up for us, to see it as an invitation to live more deeply and uncluttered. People have often shared with me what I now see as an everyday process, like going through an illness or a job loss, or that in that process they find out what's really important to them. They find out who their friends really are. And they end that process with kind of decluttering themselves of concerns and people who are really not a part of their lives. We find moving through the darkness some light and equilibrium. And there is a good judgment about who and what is really important to us. And this too is an Advent moment. The loss of a job or relationship or identity or health is not a punishment. We discover new things about ourselves and those who love and believe in us. We focus less on the things and people that no longer matter in the way that they did before the earthquake wake-up call. These are the Advent moments of our ordinary lives, and this season helps us to see and welcome them and not be afraid or bitter or judgmental. So I've already described one of these Advent moments in my life through this reflection on Isaiah's earthquake. There was in the space between waking up to the sound of something to being outside, still alive, and taking in my new reality. It was not the big one. It was not Armageddon. I was still here. So those few seconds were a kind of mini Advent that ended in relief and joy. Yvonne read the Gospel, the portion of Mark that also deals with the themes of judgment and destruction. And when the Gospel was written, Jerusalem and the temple and the Jewish community had already been destroyed. And it's very interesting that what Jesus writes and puts in the words of Jesus. Jesus, for Mark, is seen as the liberator and transformer of human suffering. In today's passage, Jesus is critical of religious and political leaders who interpret these recent wars that were in memory of the people who would have read Mark's gospel. He is critical, and he's critical of that as a method to use God and violence to get our attention, a kind of holy vengeance. There were many messiahs and false prophets then, as we have today, who misinterpret war and violence in the world as a sign of its ending, to manipulate people into doing something they may not want to do. And if you look at those first couple of verses at the beginning of Mark, Jesus' teaching begins with a differentiation between the violence and the social dislocation of the war and his description that something else, he's talking about something else. In those days after that suffering, Jesus says, something else is going to break in. It's not what religious and manipulative politicians are telling you. It is of cosmic significance, not a man-made intervention like a war. It will be so powerful and surprising that even the things that we trust, it's interesting, the reference to the moon and the sun. You know, people think that's like an eclipse. But what Jesus is talking about is that in this moment, the things that we have trusted, the institutions that have given us light and wisdom and guidance, the things that we take for granted, they're no longer available. We're in the dark. And how do we find our way? And we shuffle along in the darkness, hoping that in the end there will be some resolution, there will be some light, some transformation. So I see that reference to the sun and moon referenced differently today. And that's certainly, when we look around our country and our world today, that's certainly what a lot of us are feeling. That the institutions and the things that have given us light and guidance, we can no longer rely on. So we're in the darkness. It's a kind of Advent and the invitation to move forward. The other message in the gospel that I hear is Jesus says not only to pay attention to these moments when we're in the darkness, but also to look at the shoots, the little branches in the fig tree that still is growing, that God is still in charge. Things are not doomed to destruction, but that God is still in charge. For me, one of my favorite parts of the 9/11, when I'm down in the 9/11 museum area, they've planted trees around the fountains. And there's a particular tree that actually survived the destruction of the towers. It's a remarkable, and so they've surrounded this tree with other trees, but it's the kind of survivor tree. And that is a kind of image, an invitation of Advent, that life goes on. And this kind of way of looking at Advent is a very different message and interpretation of these judgmental texts. And it's really, it's very interesting. There are two heresies that I note on this day when these texts are read again, that I would just draw attention to. And one is America's fascination with what is called the Left Behind series. The author, Tim LaHaye, wrote many books on the subject of the end of the world, this kind of apocalyptic destruction. And the Christians are in charge of kind of redeeming the earth so that Christ can come back again. And this fascination with this kind of sci-fi Christian Left Behind. Tyndale House has sold more than 10 million related items, such as computer screensavers, postcards, and calendars. There's a Left Behind Kids series, 34 books published with a sale of more than 10 million, targeting 10 to 14-year-olds. An audio series, 2 movies. The Left Behind website attracts more than 60,000 hits a day. And the question we ask ourselves, why is this message so popular in America today? What's going on? The Washington Post suggests this. Central to their emotional appeal, it is an intense nostalgia for what we have lost, not through the imposition of God's judgment, but through the increasingly amoral existence that preceded our fall. Like most apocalyptic sagas, the series feeds on the desire to resurrect an imaginary past that is simpler and, of course, lacking in moral and social ambiguity. But LaHaye and co-writer Jenkins assert the redemptive power of an otherwise bleak take on biblical prophecy. Those left behind have a reprieve, one last chance to make things right with themselves and with their God. And I would add, but it's still, the theology is really bad. And it's not what we are reading in today's gospel. Jesus isn't using war, man-made war. He's talking about something entirely different. The theologian Harvey Cox, who taught at Harvard, says that part of the appeal of these books lies in the lip-licking anticipation of all the blood. And Paul Neuwichterlein accuses the authors of re-sacralizing violence, adding that we human beings are the ones who put our faith in superior firepower. But in the Left Behind novels, the darkness of that human satanic violence is once again attributed to God. So that's one heresy. We simply reject this Advent. The other heresy that I'm not going to talk about it much, but it's really not known. It's something that's very hidden. It's the heresy of dominionism. And you can, if you go online and Google dominionism and U.S. political life, you'll get the whole enchilada. And again, texts like these are being misused by religious and political leaders at very high levels of our national life. And dominionism, in a nutshell, is the idea that Christ will return and the world will be destroyed and redeemed when these 7 hills, the image of 7 hills, communication is a hill, the arts would be a hill, political life would be a hill. So when Christians who have a particular outlook, their job is to redeem and to be in charge, to have dominion over these hills, so that Christ can come back. So the intention is good, but it's a very heretical and dangerous theology that comes from texts like this today. And we have to be very, very careful about it. There's a kind of waking up that we have to do as thinking Christians, and to present another perspective, because as I've said, there's a link between how popular this kind of apocalyptic and violent ending that is very much a part of our culture to what we are seeing. And it's linked to people who believe that it is their Christian duty to take back, that America is a Christian country and that all other religions are inferior. Error hath no right. And it's very different. It's a very different direction from the people who framed the Constitution and the diversity and the religious tolerance that has made this country great. So it is also a kind of Advent moment as we move through this period where the institutions, the sun and the moon, no longer give us light. How do we find our way? We must become aware and wake up to the vibrations and the shakings and the crackings around us. And we also, it's interesting, in that moment, that those few seconds, my reptile brain kicked in, right? It's about survival and flight, right? It kicks in and you look, it's about saving yourself. And it may be, some of us are feeling that in our world right now. How do we save ourselves? But how does the other part of our brain, the neocortex, which is the creative that can solve problems, how does that kick in? And that we have to get beyond the reptile brain of self-interest and self-survival to move into this different space, to figure out the kind of community and world that we want to live in and to leave behind for future generations. So I hope as we deal this Advent with these difficult texts that we have to be aware of how they speak to us and how they have historically been misused right up to our present day. And also how we see in the ordinary moments of our lives how Advent breaks in. I want to end with a kind of I want to end on a kind of bright note, because it is about the light and the darkness. That's what Advent's about. And it's a story about our own journey together when St. Peter's was going through the search. And it's very interesting, you can elect a pope in 6 weeks, but St. Peter's took nearly 2 years to choose a vicar because St. Peter's is a special place. And so we were talking, and we were engaged with the search committee for maybe 6 months, and talking and coming to visit and going back and forth. And we were right down to, I remember it was Labor Day weekend, and Mila and I, we went to Nantucket to spend a couple of long weekend with some friends. And that was the weekend of the big decision that Chris Mann was trying to get the vestry together and kind of make a decision. And so we were in Nantucket with friends, and we were not very, we weren't easy to be around that weekend because we were very anxious about what this decision was going to mean for us. And we were also very much attracted and invested in this relationship, this new relationship that would be a kind of earthquake in our lives, but we thought for good. And the call didn't come that weekend. And so obviously we thought someone else is going to be the vicar at St. Peter's. And also we realized how important this process and this decision was for us, that we felt that if this didn't happen, that we would be diminished. It would be a huge blow to us. And I think it was on Tuesday or Wednesday that Chris Mann finally called and said, "Oh yes, we've made the decision, And it was great. And while we were on Nantucket, a friend of ours has a shop there. And in the shop was this wonderful maritime pennant. Some of you may have seen this in the clergy dressing room. I have it. But when clergy are on board a ship, you fly this. Shows that if you need a priest, he's on that ship or she's on that ship. So this was hanging up in Colleen's shop, and she said to me, "If you get St. Peter's, we're going to give you this flag." So that came. That was nice. But that in itself, that's a happy Advent. But that Advent moment, how we live with anticipation and live with not knowing, live in the darkness, and how we kind of make our way through. These are the moments that God invites us, that God says, "I am with you in that process and in that journey," and to have hope and to have light, that the shoots of the tree will continue to bud and to grow.